Continuing in this discussion of the importance of prices, we now look specifically at price controls. And the first one we look at is what's called a price floor. This is when the government, it's usually the government that does this, will enforce a maximum price at which a particular good can change hands. Assume the equilibrium price and quantity of sorghum, that's an agricultural product used in cattle feed mostly, $250 per metric ton and 1.3 million metric tons respectively. We see that on this graph here. For instance, you see price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, and notice here the equilibrium price is $290 per metric ton, and at that particular price 1.3 million metric tons are supplied and demanded. And remember, equilibrium means that quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, and the market is said to clear. There's no excess, no surplus, no shortage of that. So there's our starting point. But let's say the federal government believes that farmers aren't making enough money at 250 metric tons, so it says no, the minimum price at which sorghum can be sold is $290 per metric ton. And at that price, now, the quantity sold equals quantity supplied, equals 1.6 million metric tons, but quantity demanded is only 1.1 million metric tons. We want to graph these values and then see what the result of this is. Notice here, let's identify the very first position we were in. There's $250, the market clearing price, and the market clearing quantity, the equilibrium quantity and price. $250, 1.3 million metric tons. But notice here how we represent this. If the price as it is, 290, is higher than the market clearing price, then notice here that this many units will be demanded at that price. Only 1.1 million metric tons will be demanded, yet 1.6 million metric tons will be supplied. In other words, suppliers will say, wow, at that price I'm going to sell more, I'm going to produce and sell more sorghum. I might even take some corn out of production, some acreage of corn or wheat out of production, and produce sorghum. But these, at this higher price here, those people who would have used sorghum at the lower price will say, I'll substitute corn, I'll substitute something else. But they're not going to buy as much corn sorghum as they would have. And so notice it's a point where this essentially this line here for the price, for this particular price, where it touches the demand curve that designates the amount of or the quantity of sorghum that will be demanded at that particular price, and where this line here touches the supply curve or intersects it, designates the designates the quantity of sorghum that will be supplied at that particular price. Well, you can see here the quantity supplied is much greater than the quantity demanded, and so this will produce a surplus for us. How would you characterize the imbalance between quantity supplied and quantity demanded at the imposed price, and how much is it? Well, quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded by 0.5 million metric tons. Let's make sure we see that. 1.6 million metric tons are going to be supplied. 1.1 million metric tons will be demanded at that fixed price, at the controlled price. And so that's where the 0.5 million metric tons, since quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded, that would be a surplus of those units. How many more or fewer units are exchanged at the imposed price compared to what would have been exchanged at the equilibrium price? And the answer to that is, at the market price, 1.3 million metric tons would have been bought and sold, but under the price floor, only 1.1 million metric tons. So the price floor results in 0.2 million metric tons fewer being traded. Let's go back and look at this picture, and let me just make this point. You know, these guys are willing to supply 1.6 million metric tons, okay? But the lower value of these is going to prevail. Demanders will only actually agree to buying 1.1 million metric tons at that price. So that's how many units will actually be bought and sold. So notice here, not only is there a surplus of items, but actually the number of units that it changes hands is going to be 0.2 million metric tons fewer under the price controls. Now, by the way, let's look back at this notion of consumer surplus. This is what consumer surplus was before. This was producer surplus down here. Well, notice what happens is now, because the trade takes place up here, the consumer surplus is much smaller. It's right up here because actually they're being asked to pay, being required to pay a higher price if they want the goods than they did. So they've got lower consumer surplus than they did before. As a matter of fact, they've lost this much consumer surplus to the producers. Notice here, though, there's this little section, and by the way, the consumer surplus that's lost is gained by the producers. The producers are better off than they were before to the extent of the gain that they have made right here. And that's really going to be the let's say, motivation for a government to impose, in this case, a price floor, to transfer wealth, as it were, from the consumers of the good to the producers, the farmers in this case. Of course, the farm lobby is a very powerful one in the U.S. But notice here, there's also something, because this portion of what was consumer and producer surplus is lost. That's a deadweight loss. These little bitty triangles here, because notice this section relates to trades or transactions that will never occur, because only 1.1 million metric tons will be exchanged. And so any of this consumer or producer surplus related to these 0.2 million metric tons that won't be sold, well, that's what's called a deadweight loss. And so there's an overall reduction, because of the price floor, there's an overall reduction in the sum of producer and consumer surplus. And what we see is actually a transfer of surplus from consumers to producers by virtue of this situation here. Let's go to the other circumstance. By the way, another good example of this sort of transfer is minimum wage laws. If you've got let's say the market clearing minimum wage is $10 per hour, but the government in the given locale has established $15 as a minimum wage. Well, in that case, you're going to have a transfer of wealth essentially from the producers of a good to the you're going to have a transfer of wealth from the consumers of a good to the suppliers of a good. In other words, minimum wage workers are going to have a greater share of this surplus here that's going to be at the expense of the demanders. In other words, mainly small businesses. Walmart and those large suppliers, they don't worry about minimum wage laws. Many of them pay more than minimum wage anyway for the vast majority of their employees. But anyway, this is a good example, and you really want to follow up on that one, because what it does also result in some people, for instance, there are people who were employed at minimum wage, at the market determined wage before, who with the price floor are going to see an increase in their wage if they keep their job. But some people are going to lose their job because, as you see in the same thing here, there will be fewer minimum wage workers demanded, that is, hired at a $15 an hour wage than at say $10 or anything below the $15 an hour wage. So it's really sort of a deceptive thing to think that if you're a minimum wage worker and there's a $15 minimum wage enacted, that you're going to be the one making those. It's really a complicated circumstance. The intentions very often are good, but the delivery, the actual results can result in business closures, and of course in minimum wage workers simply losing their jobs. Or you've got somebody who's got a minimum wage right now earning $10 an hour, and minimum wage goes up, and they actually get elbowed out by somebody who's comes into the workforce, maybe teenagers or non-working spouses, things like that. And so you may have people that are poorly educated, maybe low skilled, and they actually lose their jobs for a variety of reasons. Okay, I think we've answered those questions. Let's look at the effects of a price ceiling. I tell you what, I'm going to go ahead and cut to another video here So we've got these contained, each of them in there on video.